Hello and welcome to today's episode of The Jungle. Today we're going to read pages 62 to 66. So this is not a mistake, this is a big chunk of the book that we're skipping. We left off last on page 44, 45, something like that. Alright, so here's what you missed. All kinds of little side story stuff happens, and we're sticking with the main characters basically, and specifically focusing on the main themes of the Pure Food and Drug Act, which gets passed because of this book and because of people's horror at how their food is being produced, and also talking about labor reform, which will come to your timeline later, which is why he wrote this book, even though labor reform doesn't really come about until the 1930s, 1938 even. He doesn't achieve that goal with this book, but I think it's easy to read this book and see how much better off we are today with some rules about labor reform. It doesn't mean that we're perfect, but we've come a long way. Okay, so one big main theme that we skipped in the 20-some pages that we're skipping over here is that Jurgis and his family have decided they can't live in this boarding house anymore because it's a horrible situation there. They're going to buy a house, and they get approached by this guy who is, he's like handing out brochures or little magazines with these pictures of this perfect little house on it. It's a little white house with a picket fence. It's not a big house, it's not a fancy house, but they look at it and think, you know, like, that's the American dream. And it looks like it might be something that they can afford. It's not going to be a luxury type house, but it's something that, you know, that they think that they can manage to do. So they end up signing the contract, and then a couple of things happen. When they finally get the house, first of all, it's not the house from the picture. The house that they end up getting sold is about 15 years old, the siding's falling off, it has no insulation in it, it's built over this garbage dump, and so the foundation on it is cracking, and the walls are, we say the walls are racking, which means that instead of being straight up and down, that they're kind of twisting, which then makes the foundation bad, it makes the roof bad, it makes the walls fall apart, it makes the windows pop out and not seal. All kinds of things are wrong with a house with racked walls. So first of all, there's no truth in advertising laws right now. Is it illegal for the guy to show him a picture of one house and sell them a totally different house? Not really. And even if it was illegal, like, what are they going to do about it? The second thing that happens to them, though, is that they find out that they didn't actually buy the house, that they are leasing the house. And they didn't understand that language when they signed the contract. They only speak Lithuanian, they can't read English, and they had somebody look over the contract with them because they were afraid of getting ripped off. And the person who they had look it over said, no, this is a perfectly legal contract. But there was a miscommunication. They're not buying the house, they're leasing the house. And what that means is that if they miss even 1 month's house payment, that they can be kicked out and the people who own the house take it back. And in reality, it's a scam, but it was a legal scam where these homeowners could basically, you know, like, you pay on a house and pay on a house and pay on a house, and you're several $1,000s into paying on this house, and if you miss even one payment, they can kick you out and take the house back and then resell it to somebody else. They were making a lot of money off of doing it this way, and they're making a lot of money off of people who didn't know any better, who couldn't read the contract, who didn't speak English, you know, who didn't understand that that's the way that it was being done. Okay, right about the same time, they're having some job problems. Some of the adults who had been working in the family have lost their jobs or are looking at maybe losing their jobs because Packingtown is starting to slow down for the season. They don't have as much work, and so their income is a little bit less, and so now they're really very afraid that they're going to lose this house on top of everything else. So we're starting top of page 62 if you're following along. So, after all, there was a crack in the fine structure of Jurgis's faith in things as they are. The crack was wide while Dede Antanas was hunting a job. Dede Antanas is Jurgis's father. The crack was wide while Dede Antanas was hunting a job, and it was yet wider when he finally got it. For one evening, the old man came home in a great state of excitement with the tale that he had been approached by a man in one of the corridors of the pickle rooms of Durham's and asked what he would pay to get a job. He had not known what to make of this at first, but the man had gone on with a matter-of-fact frankness to say that he could get him a job, provided that he were willing to pay 1/3 of his wages for it. Okay, in case you're wondering in the back of your head, wait a minute, that's not how that's supposed to work. You're right. You're not supposed to have to pay to get a job. You're supposed to get paid to do the job. But in Packingtown, the jobs are so scarce and so many people want them. And Dede Antanas, they describe as being very old. In reality, he's probably in his 50s, maybe early 60s. But for Packingtown, that's old. And so he's been trying to find a job. It's killing him that he's not contributing to the family and that he's eating the food and living in the house but not able to monetarily, give them some income. And so he's desperate to get a job. And so even though this sounds like a scam, he's willing to take them up on it. Was he a boss? Antanas had asked, to which the man had replied that it was nobody's business, but he could do what he said. Jurgis had made some friends by this time, and he sought one of them and asked what this meant. The friend, who was named Timosius, was a sharp little man who folded hides on the killing beds, and he listened to what Jurgis had to say without seeming at all surprised. They were common enough, he said, such cases of petty graft. Okay, two words there that I want you to be able to understand before we go on. Petty means small or unimportant. If you have a petty fight with somebody, you don't even remember what you're fighting over. It may have blown up to be a huge fight, but you don't remember what started the fight even. It wasn't an important matter that started the fight. Graft has several meanings. So, for instance, if you're badly burned, you might have to undergo a skin graft, where usually they take skin off your rear end or off your upper leg, and they apply that skin, like they plant that skin on other parts of your body, especially your face or your arms or your chest or your neck, where it's going to be a lot more visible, because nobody will see a big scar on your rear end, but they would notice a lot of scarring on your face. So that's a skin graft. You can also graft trees and plants, where you take like two different types of apple trees and you graft them onto another kind of apple tree, and now you have 3 different kinds of apples that grow on one tree. Those are all definitions of graft that are not this one. What we're talking about here with the word graft is demanding extra pay to do a job that you are already paid to do. So, if we were sitting in the classroom, the example that I'd use right now is, I'm your teacher, and I am being paid to assign you an assessment of the amount of learning that's happened, also called your grade, okay? So, if I suddenly said one day, all right, here's the deal. If you don't pay me money, the highest grade you're going to get in this class is a C. If you want to get a B or an A, you better be willing to pay me a little extra money to get those grades, to get that assessment of your learning. Okay, that would be graft. I'm already getting paid to give you the assessment or give you the grade that you've earned. If I'm demanding extra pay in order to do that, you got to slip me a $20 bill on your test or whatever, that's graft. For example, a police officer who's already being paid to protect people and protect their property, if the police officer comes to your store and says, there are a lot of criminals in the neighborhood around here, you really want me to watch your store, you're going to have to pay me extra to stop somebody from vandalizing your store. That would be graft. It's illegal. Bottom line. It happens all the time. It definitely happened during the time period of this book in the late 1800s and early 1900s, especially in Chicago. Unfortunately, part of Illinois history is that Chicago is famous for graft and political corruption, and people taking bribes. It's just part of Chicago's history. It is, and that's kind of, when other people around the world hear about Chicago, that's what they know about Chicago, is the history of corruption, unfortunately. Okay. They were common enough, he said, such cases of petty graft. It was simply some boss who proposed to add a little to his income. After Jurgis had been there a while, he would know that the plants were simply honeycombed with rottenness of that sort. The bosses grafted off the men grafted off each other, and someday the superintendent would find out about the boss, and then he would graft off the boss. Quit licking me. It makes it very hard to concentrate. Yes, I'm talking to you. Don't chew on my strings either. Sorry. After Jurgis had been there a while, he would know that the plants were simply honeycombed with rottenness of that sort. The bosses grafted off the men, and they grafted off each other, and I already read that sentence. Sorry. Anyway, and someday the superintendent would find out about the boss, and then he would graft off the boss. Warming to the subject, Timosius went on to explain the situation. Here was Durham's, for instance, owned by a man who was trying to make as much money off of it as he could, and he did not care in the least how he did it. And underneath him ranged in ranks and grades like an army, were managers and superintendents and foremen, each one driving the man next below him and trying to squeeze out of him as much work as possible. And all the men of the same rank were pitted against each other, and the accounts of each were kept separately, and every man lived in terror of losing his job if another made a better record than he, meaning if he did more work, or had it recorded that he was doing more work. Doesn't necessarily mean that he was. So from top to bottom, the place was simply a seething cauldron of jealousies and hatreds. There was no loyalty or decency anywhere about it, and there was no place in it for a man who counted for anything against $1. And worse than there being no decency, there was not even any honesty. The reason for that? Who could say? It must have been old Durham in the beginning. It was a heritage which the self-made merchant had left to his son, along with his millions. Jurgis would find out these things for himself if he stayed there long enough. It was the men who had to do all the dirty jobs, and there was no deceiving them, and they caught the spirit of the place and did like all the rest. Jurgis had come there and thought he was going to make himself useful and rise and become a skilled man, but he would soon find out his error, for nobody rose in Packingtown by doing good work. You could lay that down for a rule. If you met a man who was rising in Packingtown, you met a knave. That man who had been sent to Jurgis's father by the boss, he would rise. The man who told tales and spied upon his fellows would rise. But the man who minded his own business and did his work, why, they would speed him up till they had worn him out, and then they would throw him into the gutter. Jurgis went home with his head buzzing. Yet he could not bring himself to believe such things. No, it could not be so. Timosius was simply another of the grumblers. He was a man who spent all of his time fiddling. Literally, he plays the fiddle at parties. And he would go to parties at night and not get home till sunrise, and so, of course, he did not feel like working. Then, too, he was a puny little chap, and so he had been left behind in the race, and that's why he was so sore. And yet, so many strange things kept coming to Jurgis's notice every day. He tried to persuade his father to have nothing to do with the offer, but old Antinos had begged until he was worn out, and all his courage was gone. He wanted a job, any sort of a job, so the next day he went and found the man who had spoken to him, and promised to bring him 1/3 of all that he earned, and that same day he was put to work in Durham's cellars. It was a pickle room, where there was never a dry spot to stand upon, and so he had to take nearly the whole of his first week's earnings to buy him a pair of heavy-soled boots. He was a squeegee man. His job was to go about all day with a long-handled mop, swabbing up the floor. Except that it was damp and dark. It was not an unpleasant job in the summers. Now, Antinos Rudkus was the meekest man that God ever put upon the earth, and so Jurgis found it a striking confirmation of what the men all said, that his father had been at work only 2 days before he came home as bitter as any of them, and cursing Durham's with all the power of his soul. For they had set him to cleaning out the traps, and the family sat round and listened in wonder while he told them what that meant. It seemed that he was working in a room where the men prepared the beef for canning, and the beef had lain in vats of chemicals, and men with great forks speared it out and dumped it into trucks to be taken to the cooking room. By trucks here they mean like a dolly, like a little hand cart sort of thing. When they had speared out all they could reach, they emptied the vat onto the floor, and then with shovels scraped up the balance and dumped it into the truck. The floor was filthy. Yet they set Antinos with his mop slopping the pickle into a hole that connected it with a sink, where it was caught and used over again forever. And if that were not enough, there was a trap in the pipe where all the scraps of meat and odds and ends of refuse were caught, and every few days it was the old man's task to clean these out and shovel their contents into one of the trucks with the rest of the meat. This was the experience of Antinos, and then there came also Jonas and Maria with tales to tell. Maria was working for one of the independent packers and was quite beside herself and outrageous with triumph over the sums of money she was making as a painter of cans. But one day she walked home with a pale-faced little woman who worked opposite her, Yadva Marcinkus by name, and Yadva told her how she, Maria, had chanced to get her job. She had taken the place of an Irish woman who had been working in that factory ever since anyone could remember, for over 15 years, so she declared. Mary Dennis was her name, and a long time ago she had been seduced and had a little boy. He was a cripple and an epileptic, but still he was all that she had in the world to love, and they had lived in a little room alone somewhere back of Halstead Street, where the Irish lived. Mary had consumption, and all day long you might hear her coughing as she worked. Of late, she had been going all to pieces, and when Maria came, the forelady had suddenly decided to turn her off. The forelady had come up with a certain standard herself, and could not stop for sick people, Yadva explained. The fact that Mary had been there so long had not made any difference to her. It was doubtful if she even knew that, for both the forelady and the superintendent were new people, having only been there 2 or 3 years themselves. Yadva did not know what had become of the poor creature. She would have gone to see her, but had been sick herself. She had pains in her back all the time, Yadva explained, and feared that she had womb trouble. It was not fit work for a woman, handling 14-pound cans all day. Okay, a couple things there. First of all, the disease that is referred to as consumption here is tuberculosis, which we talked about the other day. It's a lung disease that basically causes you to drown to death in fluid in your lungs. It may take a long time, though. They called it consumption because the disease seemed to consume your body. You lost strength, you lost weight very rapidly, you were pale all the time. It was like a vampire was sucking the blood out of you, as we described it. They didn't understand about germs then and how this was being spread. Turns out tuberculosis was being spread through the air by little spit droplets, and also by the fact that people were spitting all the time on the floor, which is the same floor that they're then scraping all the meat off of and dumping into the canning vat to be sold to people. Yep, it's great. It was a striking circumstance that Jonas, too, had gotten his job by the misfortune of some other person. Jonas pushed a truck loaded with hams from the smoke rooms to an elevator, and thence to the packing rooms. The trucks were all of iron and heavy, and they put about 70 hams on each of them, a load of more than 1/4 ton. On the uneven floor, it was a task for a man to start one of these trucks, unless he was a giant, and when it was once started, he naturally tried his best to keep it going. Think about the giant carts at Lowe's or Menards or Home Depot or something like that you load full of drywall or full of lumber or something like that kind of thing. There was always the boss prowling about, and if there was a second's delay, he would fall to cursing. Lithuanians and Slovaks and such who could not understand what was said to them, the bosses were wont to kick about the place, like so many dogs. Therefore, these trucks went for the most part on the run, and the predecessor of Jonas had been jammed against the wall by one and crushed to death in a horrible and nameless manner. All of these were sinister incidents, but they were trifles compared to what Jurgis saw with his own eyes before long. One curious thing he had noticed the very first day in his profession of shoveler of guts, which was the sharp trick of the floor bosses whenever there chanced to come a slunk calf. Any man who knows anything about butchering knows that the flesh of a cow that is about to calve, or who has just calved, is not fit for food. A good many of these came every day to the packing houses, and of course, if they had chosen, it would have been an easy matter for the packers to keep them till they were fit for food. But for the saving of time and fodder, it was the law that cows of that sort came along with the others, and whoever noticed it would tell the boss, and the boss would start up a conversation with the government inspector, and the two would stroll away. So in a trice, the carcass of the cow would be cleaned out, and entrails would have vanished. It was Jurgis's task to slide them into the trap, calves and all, and on the floor below they took out these slunk calves and butchered them for meat, and used even the skins of them. So if you didn't put that all together yet, a slunk calf is an unborn calf. So the mother cow comes to the butcher's house pregnant, and they're not supposed to butcher that meat because when any animal, including humans, are pregnant, the baby is basically sucking all the nutrients out of the mother's body. All the nutrition, all the vitamins are going, instead of going to the mother's body, which would create healthy meat, they're going to the baby's body instead. So you should really wait until the cow has given birth and then give it a couple months afterwards, and then butcher the animal if you're going to, because by then they've regained their health and their nutritional value. There's nothing like, it's not going to make you sick, it's not diseased, it's just less nutritional. And then there's a matter of the fact that they're butchering these unborn cows as well, which they weren't supposed to do. The inspector's supposed to stop that from happening, but as long as somebody distracts the inspector, it could go on just like normal. One day a man slipped and hurt his leg, and that afternoon, when the last of the cattle had been disposed of and the men were leaving, Jurgis was ordered to remain and do some special work, which this injured man had usually done. It was late, almost dark, and the government inspectors had all gone, and there were only a dozen or two of men on the floor. That day they had killed about 4,000 cattle, and these cattle had come in freight trains from far states, and some of them had gotten hurt. There were some with broken legs, and some with gored sides. There were some that had died, from what cause no one could say, and they were all to be disposed of here in darkness and silence. Downers, the men called them. And the packing house had a special elevator upon which they were raised to the killing beds, where the gang proceeded to handle them with an air of business-like nonchalance, which said, plainer than any words, that it was a matter of everyday routine. It took a couple of hours to get them out of the way, and in the end, Jurgis saw them go into the chilling rooms with the rest of the meat, being carefully scattered here and there so that they could not be identified. When he came home that night, he was in a very somber mood, having begun to see at last how those might be right who had laughed at him for his faith in America. I'd love to tell you this never happens anymore, but there was a big scandal maybe 10 years ago or so now, with a meatpacking plant where somebody smuggled in a cell phone camera and basically took a lot of video footage of these, what are called downer cows, being slaughtered. For obvious reasons, you should not butcher a downer cow. A downer cow would be one who shows up to the butcher either injured or sick or dead already. You don't know why they're injured. You don't know why they're sick. The animal may look like they have a broken leg, but do they really have a broken leg, or is there something neurological going on where they have some sort of disease that could get into the meat? If they have a broken leg, has the blood contaminated the meat at that point in time? Like, how long has it been broken? Is it a compound fracture? You don't know what kind of infection might have set in. And definitely if they're sick, you shouldn't be eating that meat. But they're doing it anyway. And just about 10 years ago in the United States, there was this huge scandal over downer cows that were being butchered. And it turns out it wasn't just this one place. Like, lots of places were doing that and had gotten away with it. So there was a big crackdown on the downer cow industry. I would assume it still goes on. Like, it's been going on since the early 1900s. And the meat packers are in it to make money. Like, that's their goal. And so if you take, the more cattle that you take in, the more animals that you take in to butcher, that's more product for you to sell. So on that happy note, we'll be done for today. Thanks! Bye!